Far From Home, The Adventures of Yellow Dog is a 1995 family adventure film about a... Wait a minute, I'm not reviewing that! I'm gonna start this review by saying I haven't seen a Spider-Man movie since Tobey Maguire was Spider-Man. And first things first, there will be spoilers for Avengers Endgame, even before the spoiler section, because you can't really avoid that in talking about a film that's essentially a sequel to it. If you haven't seen that, and you don't want to be spoiled, I'm warning you to turn off the video now if you wish to avoid spoilers for it. Of course, since I haven't seen Spider-Man Homecoming or half of the Marvel Cinematic Universe films, I'm kind of going in blind again. So Tony Stark was dead to begin with, and what I only found out in Endgame is that he is, in a metaphorical and also possibly literal sense, because no one ever says otherwise as far as I know, Spider-Man's father as well as Uncle Ben's replacement in the MCU. And this movie does nothing to dispel my assumption that Tony Stark is secretly Peter's dad, so I'm just gonna keep thinking that until I find evidence to the contrary. Anyway, they actually do a pretty decent job at addressing the absurdity of half the universe dying, and then coming back. Some characters are much older while Peter is still the same age he was 5 years earlier when Thanos wiped out half of the universe. I think. I haven't seen Infinity War, but I read Infinity Gauntlet. Anyway, Nick Fury is pressuring Spider-Man to take a role in reforming the Avengers, but Peter Parker is a 16-year-old kid and struggling with what to do with that. He wants to be a normal teenager and do normal teenager things, like make out with the girl he likes, clown on his bullies, and play bass in a shitty garage band in a futile attempt to get laid. Oh wait, that last one was me. It's almost as if Spider-Man Homecoming is two separate movies stuck together with flex tape. One that I kinda like, and one that I think sucks. The one I like is the action movie with Spider-Man and the Avengers, and one I don't like is Peter Parker and the watered-down 80s teen comedy. I was surprised by the former because I initially disliked the idea of Spider-Man going off on an adventure outside of New York City, since Spidey has usually been a street-level hero, and only occasionally takes on greater scope threats, and New York is such an important part of the character's identity. I admit, I was skeptical. Yet the European set pieces were a lot of fun, even if they do kind of reek of a Happy Madison-styled "let's film a movie somewhere where we'd like to go on vacation." And it's not entirely without precedent in the comics, as in the 90s graphic novel Spider-Man Spirits of the Earth, he takes a trip to Scotland. And I mean, there was that one time he went to space and got a living suit, and you know what happened after that. This is also pretty much my first exposure to Tom Holland as Spider-Man outside of his 5 minutes or whatever in Endgame, and I think he does a pretty good job. He reminds me a lot of Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future and is generally pretty likable. He's also got a good physicality for playing Spider-Man, and that adds a lot to the believability in the fight scenes. The European locales look really nice, and I'm sure the local tourism boards of Venice, Prague, and London will get a nice uptick in nerd tourists that want to gawk at the locations where the movie took place. But the scenes with Peter and his classmates just feel like I've seen all of them before. I feel like they're aiming for kind of a John Hughes feel with these scenes, which is probably great if you haven't seen a John Hughes movie or the 30 years of people imitating his films. I mean, God, can you imagine somebody imitating someone just wholeheartedly without any irony? What kind of asshole would do that? But it all falls kind of flat, and Peter's friends aren't all that interesting to me. Peter's love interest is basically Daria, and if you don't get that reference, you probably won't find her as uninspired as I do. And his friends are just all kind of stereotypes. the fat, nerdy best friend, so-and-so from Strong Bad's Teen Girl Squad, and so on. I guess I have certain expectations of Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and this doesn't meet them, so it feels unfamiliar. And all these people could have different names, and my mind would probably have had an easier time accepting it. Anyway, the teenagers banter and get jealous and have misunderstandings. These parts of the movie bring nothing new to the table, with one exception. I do feel Far From Home attempts to capture some glints of modern youth culture better than many superhero movies do. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man largely sidestepped it in part because Peter wasn't in high school for the entirety of the movie. But the X-Men movies always had a supporting cast of students, and they were mostly only doing generic student things. The first 3 X-Men movies came out when I was in middle and high school, but they didn't really address youth culture at all, despite having teenage protagonists. Far From Home actually incorporates things that modern teenagers do, like texting, gaming, Snapchat, vandalizing public property, things that make it an interesting snapshot of the culture when the film was made, while subsequently also making it instantly dated to 2019, as dated as the 70s and 80s songs in the movie soundtrack. At least one of those makes sense in context. And the Marvel movies have had a problem with being overly quippy and jokey since the second Joss Whedon signed on to make the Avengers, and surprisingly they've gotten worse long since he was exiled to the salted earth that is the DC cinematic universe. I haven't seen all of them, but Far From Home is arguably the worst I've seen in this regard. I mean, I'll give the film credit for at least getting each character have their own type of quip, but Peter is always being awkward with his friends, MJ is always role-playing as Daria, and the teachers are always being manic and zany. It gets exhausting and tiresome. Everything is constantly punctuated with the joke, and the movie front-loads a lot of jokes in. It gets pretty grating pretty fast. Like if I was to make this sound for 20 minutes. I will say positively that Spider-Man's fight scenes with the movie's villains are all exciting and visually inventive. Anytime Spidey goes into action, the scenes are alight with color and rapid-fire visual effects. The main villain himself is interesting and has a solid motive for his crimes, and he's even kind of a smarmy, self-important douchebag. He's an evil mirror of Tony Stark, if you will, which fits the character's in-universe motivation and origins. So now we're going to get into spoilers. So if you don't want the movie to be spoiled for you, get out now. Click that back button. Get out of here. So the villain in the movie is Mysterio. If you didn't guess that Mysterio would be the villain and not a hero as advertised, you've either never experienced any Spider-Man media ever, or you're just really, really stupid. He's a disgruntled Stark engineer that's butthurt that Tony acted completely in character regarding Mysterio's holographic technology, which is a pretty plausible motive, although it does seem contrived that a ton of things in these movies tie back to Stark Industries. I mean, Howard Stark helped make Captain America. Tony Stark was the first member of the Avengers. Spider-Man is Tony Stark's protege. I'm sure I'm missing a few in the movies I haven't seen, too. And Spider-Man and his friends end up figuring out Mysterio's plan in a way that ultimately feels like an episode of Scooby-Doo. And if you think about it, that's what they're doing. Unmasking a man in a costume that obfuscates what he really is. Look, I know Spider-Man is an established hero, but for God's sake, Nick Fury, he's a 16-year-old kid. He probably can't even drive yet. But you're basically trying to recruit him as a child soldier like some kind of Middle Eastern warlord. Come on, are you really that desperate for Avengers? In the final battle of Endgame, there are at least 5 people, plus whatever Marvel acquired in the Fox acquisition. I mean, it would be one thing if he was jumping at the opportunity, but S.H.I.E.L.D. is basically holding Peter hostage, and Fury threatens to outright murder the next person walking through the door while he's talking to Peter. People that are his classmates and teachers. Haven't you learned to stop crossing these lines yet, Fury? I mean, there's Avengers you haven't even touched yet. I mean, you've already got War Machine. I mean, you could get, like, She-Hulk, Wonder Man, Cersei, Hercules, U.S. Agent, Moon Knight, Firestar, and so on. Hell, you could recruit Beast in the Avengers, and that wouldn't be a bad way to bring the X-Men into Marvel's new universe. I'm just saying, it's a little awkward that Fury is okay with sending a child into harm's way when other people are just as well suited and presumably still out there. It's a weird concept to have in a summer blockbuster aimed at the families. To summarize my thoughts, Spider-Man Far From Remarkable is an okay movie. The action is really well executed and visually exciting, but the character material falls kind of flat due to being a familiar story from other stuff. I view it as kind of like Iron Man 2. I think it's supposed to be a world-building exercise, which, well, I guess is gonna enrich the universe in the grand scheme of things, makes it a bit of a mixed bag. It's not a movie I regret seeing, but it's not one I'm gonna be in a hurry to watch again. So is there really a multiverse? Or was that just more of Mysterio's bullshit? If there is a multiverse, is Tobey Maguire Spider-Man in one of them? Did Tobey Maguire survive the snap? I would really appreciate if the MCU let us know the status of real-world actor Tobey Maguire in their universe. I mean, maybe they could fit in. If the X-Men franchise can do a distant future thing with Logan, then surely they can do the same thing with Tobey Maguire as an older Spider-Man. You could call it the Human Spider. I really need to find out if Mr. Ditkovich ever fixed that door and got his rent.